Alright, so in this video, I'm going to make a video about subordinating conjunctions. Whenever you have a subordinating conjunction in a sentence, then you have a dependent clause. And whenever you have a dependent clause, you have a complex sentence. And so these are examples of subordinating conjunctions. And so here you have after, although, as long as, although, because, before, even though, if, in order to, now that, once, rather than, since, so that, then, that, though, unless, until, when, whenever, where, whereas, wherever, whether, and while. Every time you have a sentence that has these words in it, you know that sentence is a complex sentence. And so these subordinating conjunctions always start a dependent clause. So here you have some examples. After John eats dinner, he goes to bed. Although Jack is fat, he eats very little. As soon as the alarm clock rings, Steve jumps out of bed. Another thing you will notice about all of these sentences is that after you have a dependent clause, after John eats dinner, you always have a comma. So after John eats dinner, comma, he goes to bed. Although Jack is fat, comma, he eats very little. As soon as the alarm clock rings, comma, Steve jumps out of bed. As long as I study hard, comma, I can get good grades. And so all of these words, with all of these sentences, these are all complex sentences because after John eats dinner, it's not a complete thought. That is a dependent clause. And so when you have a dependent clause, incomplete thought, with a independent clause, he goes to bed, which is a complete thought. So when you have an incomplete thought and a complete thought together in one sentence, then that is known as a complex sentence. And so before I go to bed, I brush my teeth. So here you have a comma. Before I go to bed is a incomplete thought. And the reason why it is an incomplete thought is because of the subordinating conjunction before. As soon as you put the word before into the sentence, then it becomes an incomplete thought. If I were to take away before and I simply say I go to bed, then that is a complete thought. So when you use these subordinating conjunctions, you render the sentence incomplete. Hence the word subordinating. Because when you subordinate something, you are making something less important than something else. And that's another trait of a complex sentence, is that this after John eats dinner is not as important as he goes to bed. So if I were to read this out loud, I would say, after John eats dinner, he goes to bed. So when you write a complex sentence, the subordinating clause is less important, less emphasized than the independent clause. So if the writer wants to write two sentences and one sentence is less important than the other sentence, he uses a complex sentence. So as soon as the alarm clock rings, Steve jumps out of bed. So as soon as the alarm clock rings, that is the dependent clause because it has the subordinating conjunction as soon as long as, because, before. If I avoid sick people, comma. And so that is a sentence fragment. Whenever you have just before I go to bed, or if I avoid sick people, that's a sentence fragment. So that you cannot just write that alone. I see that as a very frequent essay error on people's essays. People would just write, if only I avoid sick people, period. And I'm like, no, that's not a complete sentence. That's a sentence fragment. If I avoid sick people, I can catch fewer colds. So here you have the dependent clause, if I avoid sick people. If is the subordinating conjunction, making this a dependent clause. And then you have a comma. I can catch fewer colds. That is a independent clause because I can catch fewer colds is a complete thought. So whenever you have a complete thought, that is an independent clause. Once I get my driver's license, sentence fragment, dependent clause, you need a comma. I will buy my own car. Rather than spend a lot of money on clothes, comma. That's also a dependent clause. I like to make my own clothes. Since I lost my husband, comma, I have to get a job. So the subordinating conjunction since I lost my husband is a dependent clause and it is not a complete thought. I have to get a job is a complete thought. It is an independent clause. Unless you do your job perfectly is a dependent clause because unless is a subordinating conjunction. You will be fired is a independent clause because that is a complete thought. And so the words in the table and the bolded words in these sentences are all subordinating conjunctions. So all of these words are subordinating conjunctions. So it pays to memorize these words so that every time you see these words in a sentence, you know that you have a complex sentence. And if these words come in the beginning of a sentence, you know to put a comma there. So here you have when the subordinating conjunction starts a sentence, you need a comma after that sentence. The sentence with a subordinating conjunction is a dependent clause. And if you leave the dependent clause by itself without another sentence after it, it becomes a sentence fragment. A sentence fragment is incomplete sentence. So it's an error on your essay. You lose points. So here you have after John eats dinner. Okay, after John eats dinner, then what happens? Then what? So the reader is left with a question mark. That's why it's a sentence fragment, because you're left with a fragment of a thought. So if you want to make the sentence correct, you would say, after John eats dinner, he goes to bed. That's the complete sentence, and this would be known as a complex sentence. Here are more examples of complex sentence, except this time the subordinating conjunction clause comes after the main sentence instead of before. And so when the subordinating conjunction comes after the main sentence, you don't need a comma. So I'll repeat that. When the subordinating conjunction is in the beginning of a sentence, you use a comma. If that same subordinating conjunction comes after the main thought, you do not need a comma. So this ends my video on subordinating conjunctions. So in all of these sentences, you have the subordinating conjunction that comes after the main thought. He eats very little. So that is the main thought. John goes to bed is the main thought, which is an independent clause. And so when all of these words are at the end of the sentence, or in the middle or end of the sentence, you do not need a comma. When the same words, when these subordinating conjunctions are at the beginning of a sentence, then you need a comma. That's all you need to remember if you have trouble with comma usage. And so I suggest that you memorize this list of subordinating conjunctions so that every time you see a subordinating conjunction, you know that it is a complex sentence, and you know that every time you see that particular word at the beginning of a sentence, you know to put a comma, and then you know that if that word comes at the end of the complete thought, there is no comma. And so when we use a complex sentence, then we know that both sentences do not have the same weight. They do not have the same emphasis. Unlike compound sentences, where both sentences have the same emphasis. And so it depends on the writer whether or not he wants to put equal emphasis on both sentences, or if he wants to put less emphasis on one sentence or the other. So this ends my video on subordinating conjunctions and complex sentences.